This lecture will be talking about how to embrace a culturally and linguistically diverse world. So this is a follow-up to our lecture on creating individual appropriateness for young children. So today we'll be talking about creating contextually appropriate facilities and programs for young children as well. So one of the other core considerations of DAP. It's important when we are working with young children to not just be age appropriate and individually appropriate, but to be contextually or culturally appropriate, because the United States is an incredibly diverse place to live. We have people of many different racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds. There are many languages spoken in the United States. There are many different kinds of family structures. There are many different kinds of values and beliefs about how the world works that people have. So it is not a homogeneous population. It's a heterogeneous population, and therefore it's very important to make sure that we're thinking about all of the children who could be coming to our classrooms, not just a particular group, or not just assuming that every child who comes is going to be like ourselves. So on this slide and the next two, I wanted to give you a few examples of how diverse the United States is. I think here in Southern California, we recognize that the United States is a very diverse place because we see a lot of diversity, but in some parts of the U.S., it's not as diverse. It is a bit more homogeneous, so people aren't always seeing the diversity that exists in other places. So that's not really something that we are experiencing, but I do think it's important for you to understand just how diverse the United States is. And so one example is race and how much racial diversity there is in the United States and how much racial diversity is increasing. So this graph or this image on this slide is showing you the change in racial population in the United States between 2010 and 2020. So it's showing that the number of white folks in the United States is decreasing, and that the number of people of other races is increasing across this same period. And it is predicted that by the year 2020, that whites may not be the racial majority in the United States, that they will actually be a racial minority, so that the population of whites will continue to decline and that the population of people of other races will continue to increase. So those have been the projections for quite some time, that in the next 25 years that this trend is going to continue. So you can see that the population of whites is declining, the population of people who are Hispanic is increasing, the population of people who are Black is increasing, and the population of people who fall into other categories is increasing as well. So another way in which the United States is very diverse is in terms of languages spoken. So you can see on this graph, the green kind of big bar on the top part of the graph is showing how many people speak only English at home, whereas the orange part of the graph is showing how many people speak a language other than English, and this is for people 5 years and older, and it looked from 1990 to around 2020. And so you can see that the population of people who speak only English at home is slightly increasing across that time, but not as steeply as the number of people who speak a language other than English. And so there are proportionally now more people who speak a language other than English in comparison to just speaking English than there was back in 1980. So in 1980, in terms of all the people who existed, more people spoke English only and a fewer number spoke another language. And now the balance between those two things is shifting, so that there's still mostly people who speak English at home, but the number of people who speak a language other than English is increasing across the total population. And the most common languages spoken in the United States, for sure, is Spanish or Spanish Creole. That's a huge chunk of the other language spoken in the United States. And then we have Chinese and some other ones after that that don't make up a very large proportion. But there's quite a bit of language diversity here in the United States. So I also wanted to make clear that the diversity that we see in the United States as a whole is also reflected in our schools. So schools are a representation of the greater population in the United States. They reflect the same population statistics. So you can see that in the last 35 years, U.S. schools have become more diverse, that there's about 10% of kids in U.S. schools who speak a language other than English or who are learning English. And about half of the kids who go to public school in the United States are considered to be in a minority racial group, so not white. And then just kind of an interesting statistic that only about 20% of their teachers were minorities. So we have a lot of kids in our schools who are minorities, but we don't recruit a lot of teachers who match what those children look like and what their background is. So as educators, this is something we need to pay attention to. So if you are planning to work as an educator in the United States, one, you're going to see children who have special needs because about 10 to 15% of kids in the United States have special needs. And unless you work at a private school, if you take any kind of public funding, you need to serve children with special needs, and you also need to serve the demographic population of people who live in your area. So particularly if you're planning to continue to live and work in Southern California, we know that we have a lot of diversity here. We have a lot of people who are ethnically, culturally, racially, linguistically different from one another, and they all come to schools together. So regardless of your own racial, ethnic, cultural, linguistic background, you're going to have children in your class who are bringing diversity to the table. So it's really important that we think about how we can navigate that. So on the next slide, I'm going to give you kind of a laundry list of things that we're going to be covering in this lecture that are important to our work as educators who exist in classrooms with diversity. So here's the things we're going to be talking about over the next quite a few slides. So first we're going to start with just basic terminology. So I mentioned on the previous slides things like culture and race and ethnicity, and it's important for us to make sure that we understand those definitions, understand exactly what those things are, because if we don't have the same basic terminology, we have a hard time talking about the same thing with each other. Then we're also going to talk about bias and how we, how we as humans are sort of hardwired to be biased, but things that we can do to make sure that we're not bringing that into our classrooms. How important it is to engage in self-reflection and to learn as much as we can about diversity issues. And then finally, we'll wrap up the lecture with talking about some specific educational strategies that we can use to address diversity-related issues effectively in our classrooms. So let's first talk about some terminology. So we're going to talk about on this slide culture, ethnicity, and race, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about culture on the next slide. So culture is kind of the overarching term, and ethnicity falls underneath that. So ethnicity is kind of a subcategory of culture. So culture basically refers to things that you share with other people. So beliefs that you share, values that you share, customs that you share, traditions, behaviors that you share with a particular group. And you can see on the graphic to the left that there are various things that we can be the same as other members of our group. So we can like the same foods, we can like to read the same literature, listen to the same music, fashion. So, one aspect of culture is youth culture. So we A lot of times young people in our country or in other countries kind of have their own culture, like a subset of the larger culture of their country. And so youth may like, they may gravitate towards certain kinds of music or fashion or dances or ways of speaking with each other that are different than, older adults in, the country. And it's kind of agreed upon sort of what that youth culture is and what young people are kind of all doing the same. But I do want you to understand that culture is more than just these kind of surface level things. It's how you feel about stuff. It's attitudes towards all different kinds of things in the world. So attitudes towards your elders, attitudes towards how animals should be treated, what kinds of manners are important. Is it important to be married, or is that not really something that's important? So it's both surface level things and it's more deep things. So often different generations have different kind of groups and have separate cultures from each other. So that's why we talk about like millennials and like how they are, and Gen Xers and how they are, and the Gen Zers and how they are, because there's this assumption that there's something that's similar about people in those particular groups in relation to all these different cultural aspects. Now, ethnicity is culturally related, but it's a little bit different. So you can adopt certain values and likes and dislikes and ways of functioning in the world as you move along and meet new people and kind of create your, like, I'm going to be part of this culture. But ethnicity is typically things like you're born into them. So you're born into a particular country, you're born into a particular place to live, you're born into a family that has particular traditions and values. You're born into a family that has a particular religious affiliation or speaks a particular kind of language. So ethnicity is more about kind of our ancestral roots, sort of where did we come from. So, if you are from Mexico and you have relatives in Mexico and you celebrate holidays that are affiliated, so you don't celebrate American Mother's Day, you celebrate Mother's Day on Mexican Mother's Day, or you celebrate Dia de los Muertos, or any of the other myriad things that your family has been doing based on the place that your family originally came from and the language that you speak that is the family of your relatives and your ancestors. So ethnicity is more about kind of the things we're born into, but many of the things we're born into are related to culture, because culture is about language and religion and holidays and flags and all of the things that also go along with ethnicity. So ethnicity is kind of a subset of culture. And then race is, people often confuse ethnicity and race, and they are not the same thing. So race really is just looking at people and saying, oh, okay, you all kind of look like each other. We're going to all lump you together into one group. So we're going to put all the people with pale skin and light colored eyes in one group, and we're going to put people with darker skin and darker eyes who came from this particular place in another group, and we're going to put people who don't have an epicanthic fold, so that's the fold that many of us have in our eyelids, but many Asian people do not. So we're going to take those people and we're going to put them in a different group. But what I really want you to understand is that culture, ethnicity, and race are socially constructed ideas. We did not have to group people in those particular ways. We did not have to say that everyone who looks a particular way is white, or everyone who looks a particular way is black, or everyone who does this particular thing is Scandinavian, or whatever different groups we decided to separate people into. Those were things that were socially constructed by people over time. They are not innate to the human being themselves. So being white, your skin color might be innate and part of your genetics, but being labeled as a white person is not innate or genetic. It is a social label that was created at a point in time and then was given to people who looked a particular way. So it's really important for us to understand that social construction piece of these different terms. So these facts about culture were taken from your textbook. So they were taken from the chapter, except the last one. I added that one in because that's where we're going to head on the next slide. But everyone has culture. I think sometimes people, if they're in a majority culture of a country, they don't think they have culture, but we do. We all have culture. We all have music that we like to listen to, and traditions and values and beliefs and attire and all the things that make culture culture. So we all have some sort of culture. I was teaching a class one time, and we went around and asked people to say, like, if you had to name one cultural identity, what would it be? And this was in the Midwest, where there's not a lot of racial diversity. So many people gave their religious affiliation as their culture, but one woman said that her culture was rural or farming community, because that she felt like that label best fit her beliefs and values and the culture that she felt that she was part of. But everyone has culture, and culture is dynamic. Culture changes. So youth culture today is not going to be youth culture tomorrow, and it's not going to be youth culture down the road, and it wasn't the youth culture of your parents once upon a time. So culture is constantly shifting and changing, and it's a moving target. But the culture of the time, the culture to which you identify, does influence your values and beliefs. So we are in a moment right now where there is a lot of debate politically. There's lots of things going on in terms of people disagreeing with one another, and that is also shaping our values and our beliefs about how the world works and how we interact with one another and what politics means, what it means to be political. So we're in a moment of some upheaval, and that is also influencing our culture. There can absolutely be cultural differences between groups, which we often see, and I think that's what we notice more often. This group likes to do this and that group likes to do another thing. But I do want you to understand that there are cultural differences within groups as well. So it's too simplistic to say that all Gen Z people are of the Gen Z culture, because Gen Z varies widely. Some Gen Z people are conservative, some are more progressive, some like pop and some like rap and some like streetwear and some don't. And so it would be mistaken to assume that just because two people coexist in the same cultural group that they're identical to each other. Now, another thing that makes culture complicated is the last two things. And so one of the things that we need to understand about culture is that different people who sit in different cultural places may have different levels of power and status than do others. So in the United States, because white people are the majority, they have typically held more power and status than folks of other racial groups. So, there's a pretty obvious evidence of this when we look at slavery and we look at the rights and privileges that people who are Black had. If we also think about women once upon a time in our history, there wasn't always a lot of status and power afforded to women. It took a long time to be able to garner the right to vote and have a bit more status and power. Women still don't typically receive equal pay, which is another indicator of status and power. And another piece of this, and this is what we're going to cover more on the next few slides, is that what culture you sit in or exist in, or what race you are, or what ethnicity you are, can also negatively be impacted by bias. So this is where we talk about all those isms. So we have ageism and sexism and racism and ableism and all the things that we consider, certain groups to be more advantageous than other groups. So young people are better than older people, and men are better than women, and people who are able-bodied are better than people who are not able-bodied. None of these things are true, but this is what an ism is, when there's an assumption made that one group is better than another, and then the group that's considered to be better might get more advantages and opportunities than the group that is considered to be lesser than. So now that we've tackled terminology, the next thing that we need to talk about is bias. So the one thing I really want to make clear is that bias isn't something that's just done by bad people or people who are, not kind to other people. Bias is a human trait. Bias exists in all humans. Bias exists in babies. So I really want, I'm hoping that you'll watch the video that's on this slide. It's really helpful to understand how bias starts even when babies are very small, and it's over things that are very arbitrary, like do you like broccoli or do you like goldfish crackers? And for humans, bias has a utility. So unfortunately, it has a negative side, but it does have utility. So the goal of human beings is to figure out who they go with, who they belong to, what group they're in, who are the people that they can interact with to help make sure that they don't get eaten by the lion when they step outside of the cave. So bias has an evolutionary purpose, but unfortunately in our modern times, it also leads to all those isms that we were talking about on the previous slide, or can, if not handled properly. So young children their goal is to figure out what categories there are in the world. Who are my people? Who's somebody else's people? Who goes in my family? Who's in my class? Who likes the same toys as me? Who looks the same as me? So children are hardwired, just like adults are, to categorize the things around them. It's a big part of what young children are trying to figure out. And again, it does have a purpose. It does have some utility because we're safer when we're in a group, when we're with people who are like us and have the same goals and desires and wishes as each other. But one of the problematic pieces is that we tend to be very kind and nurturing and forgiving of people in our own group, and we're less kind and nurturing and forgiving to people who are not in our group. So we tend to create based on these categorizations of things in groups and out groups. And so we do hold our in-group in high regard. We don't always hold the out-group in low regard. They're just not held as in high regard as our in-group people. So most of the time we just don't pay attention to people who are in the out-group, but occasionally we do start to treat the out-group unfairly and in an unfriendly way. Maybe it looks like the out-group's going to get some stuff that the in-group wanted to have. So then the in-group starts to be unfriendly or mean to the out-group. So you can see here this quote on this slide. It says, ultimately, many forms of discrimination and bias may not develop because out-groups are hated, but because positive emotions such as admiration, sympathy, and trust are reserved for the in-group. So again, it's not that we come into the world going, I'm going to be hateful and mean to all the out-group people. What we are hardwired to do is categorize the world around us, to create in-groups, and then unfortunately, in that process, sometimes the out-groups are not treated very nicely. And again, I really hope that you watch the video clip on this slide because it not only shows how young babies create in-groups, but it also shows how sometimes the out group doesn't get treated very well in comparison. So we've already established that we all have bias. It is human nature to be biased. It is not, again, it's not bad people. It's not mean people. It's not people who were raised poorly. It's just how human beings were designed. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't know how we're designed and that we shouldn't do our best to mitigate or work against bias, but it is part of human nature. But it's very important to know what this is all about so that you can make sure that your natural inclination to build groups doesn't cause you to be mean to groups that are not your own. So there are two kinds of bias. One is called explicit bias and the other is called implicit bias. So explicit bias is when we directly do things in a biased or unfriendly or not fair way. So I say that I am not going to give another group a chance. I am not going to give them the same opportunities. I say that out loud. I take direct action. I plan it. So the example is, I don't hire whatever. I don't hire women. I don't hire men. I don't hire young people. I don't hire old people. I don't think that they're capable of doing the work. I'm going to explicitly say that. I'm going to make my thoughts and ideas and opinions very clear, and I'm going to act on those things that I think. Implicit bias, on the other hand, are these things that are kind of rumbling around back underneath the surface. They're not maybe even something we consciously realize that we're doing. So sometimes when kids raise their hand in class, sometimes teachers are more likely to call on some kids versus others, and they're not even aware that they're doing it. And maybe they're more likely to call on boys or more likely to call on girls or more likely to call on kids who don't have disabilities or more likely to call on kids who do have disabilities, and they're not even realizing that this is something that they're doing. That would be implicit bias. It's subconscious, it's under the surface, it's not something that you planned, but it's something that you are doing, even if you're not aware of it. So there are things that impact how biased or not biased, or what kind of bias or what kinds of biases we have. So we're going to talk a little bit about beliefs that might lead us to have certain kinds of biases, experiences that might lead us to have certain kinds of biases, and then cognitive things, so innate things that our brain does that create bias. So it is both an innate and an environmental thing. It is a relationship between the two. So your brain is hardwired to do certain things and process information in a particular way that leads to bias. But then you also have experiences that you have along the way that also factor into your biases. And then those become beliefs that are either implicitly or explicitly expressed to the people around you. So we all hold beliefs. Everyone, we all have bias. We all hold beliefs. Those beliefs come from those cognitive ways that our brain functions that we'll talk about in a minute, and they also come from the experiences that we have that we'll talk about in a minute. But everyone has personal beliefs and values, and sometimes those personal beliefs and values cause us to think, react, and behave in particular ways. So I want you to think about, I'm not going to talk about all these personal beliefs and child-rearing beliefs and values, but I do want you to think about these questions and see if you can answer some of these questions for yourself about who you are, what kinds of beliefs and ideas and values that you personally hold for yourself, what kinds of beliefs, values, and ideas that you hold in terms of working with young children and how they should be raised up. But I also want you to understand this little graphic on the left. So things can come from our personal beliefs and values that ultimately drive our behavior. So one, based on the life experiences and the cognitive biases that I innately have, I might land on a way of thinking about people that is potentially not true. So stereotypes are not true. They're not fact. Sometimes they emanate from facts, but they are taking a fact about one person or a couple people and they're applying them to whole groups of people. So one stereotype that we hold in our society is that women are bad drivers. I know many women who are perfectly capable drivers, and in fact, when we look at data and statistics, the reason why young men's insurance is so high is because young men are much more likely to get in accidents than any other group, which makes us think that if we have a stereotype that women are bad drivers, then that is not correct, because it is not statistically being upheld with the data that we have. but sometimes people believe that. They are painting a whole group of people with a brush because maybe they had an experience with a person who was a bad driver, or they were told their whole lives that women are bad drivers, and they're using that to make decisions about people that are not factually correct. Unfortunately, those stereotypes, those things that we believe about whole groups of people, can color how we feel about people. And then sometimes we might feel negatively or positively about groups of people based on these stereotypes that we've heard. So if we've heard that all Asians are smart, then we might treat Asians like they are smart, and we might give them opportunities to be smart. If we have heard that other people are lazy, other groups of people, that we might treat those other groups of people like they're lazy, even if they are not. So stereotypes, unfortunately, affect how we feel about people, which is prejudice, and then that in turn affects how we treat people, which is discrimination. So the beliefs that you hold heavily influence your stereotypes, your prejudice, and your discrimination. Now, those beliefs, those biases, those stereotypes, those prejudices, those discriminatory behaviors, they come from both your experiences and they also come from your cognitive biases. So let's talk for a minute on this slide about experiences. So again, I really hope that you watch this video. It does a really nice job of showing how kids get ideas about the world and how it works through the way that they were raised. There's a little boy in this video who says, I don't have friends that are not the same color as me because my mom wouldn't like it. She wouldn't want me to bring those kids over, and she wouldn't want me to play with them and be friends with them. And then unfortunately, sometimes those turn into biases, beliefs, stereotypes, prejudices, discriminatory behaviors towards people and other groups. Now, sometimes there are experiences that we have that reduce our likelihood to have biases, to have beliefs that aren't supportive of groups outside of ourselves, to be less stereotypical, to be less prejudicial, to be less discriminatory, and college is one of those experiences. So there is data to show that across several racial groups that going to college makes you more likely to reject negative stereotypes. So if somebody brings up a stereotype and said, oh, all women are bad drivers, someone who went to college might say, well, actually, I've seen the data on driving statistics and I know that's not true. Or all Asians are smart. Well, actually, I've been in class with all kinds of kids and everybody does about the same. It doesn't really seem to matter what somebody's race is. So having experience with people who are not like yourself and having experiences where you have access to data and statistics is good for us in the sense that it reduces bias and it reduces some of those negative outcomes of bias that could be possible otherwise. First pieces are a little bit more easy to navigate because if you know that humans are biased, you can try and have experiences that give you more opportunities to interact with a variety of people. You can read and learn and not believe that stereotype, go find data to support an alternative viewpoint, talk with other people, get to know other people. But our brains are always kind of working in the background and they're hindering us a little bit because our brain is set up to take in information in particular ways, and sometimes the way that our brain takes in information makes it a little difficult for us to resist these biases that are out there. So again, I'd really encourage you to watch the video. It does a great job of explaining cognitive bias and how it works and how we can work against it, how we can sort of take our brain back and not let it fool us into thinking that the world is a particular kind of way. So I do hope you watch the video. It does talk about a couple of the biases that I have listed on this slide, but then it also talks about other ones, so you get a little bit more information. But I will explain the 3 biases that your brain has that are on this slide. So the first one is confirmation bias. So as humans, if we already believe something, we tend to look for data that confirms what we already know or believe. And if we run across data that doesn't line up with our worldview, we'll ignore it, or we'll dispute it, or we'll discount it, and we'll only glom on to the data that confirms what we already know. So we're not really being open-minded generally when we're reading or listening to others or watching the news, because we're just picking up on pieces that confirm what we already think. So another one is called primacy effects. So a primacy effect is that we tend to believe the first thing that we hear or see, whether it's true or not. So I'm going to use the example of vaccines here. So like 30 years ago, an article was published that said that the MMR vaccine causes autism. And that was really people's first bit of information related to autism and anything to do with vaccines. That paper has been unpublished. That researcher has been convicted of, like in the court of higher education, convicted of fraud. They've had their medical license and their PhD stripped from them. And the reason is because it was junk science. And it wasn't even just junk science, it was deliberately false science. It was a deliberately false publication. And there have been numerous articles published since then that definitively prove that the MMR vaccine does not cause autism. But once people had that bell rung for them, it could not be unrung. And we're still talking about how the MMR vaccine causes autism when the paper that said that was false, was not true, and all the data that is true has been ignored. But that's the kind of thing that our brain will do. Another thing that our brain will do is the fundamental attribution error. So we tend, again, we talked about this when we first started talking about bias, we tend to be very kind to people in our in-group, and then we're not so kind to people in the out-group. So if somebody in the in-group makes a mistake, we might say, oh, they didn't mean to, oh, it was an honest mistake, oh, that's not really what they were trying to do. We give grace to people in our in-group. We do not give grace to people who are in the out group. And people in the out group, we tend to treat them and judge them very harshly for the same things that somebody in the in group may have done. And you see this playing out all the time. Like there's always some story of somebody who was in somebody's in group got a pass, and then somebody who was in the out group got vilified. And unfortunately, these are the kinds of things that our brain does. And the most important thing is to know that your brain does this and then do your very best to work against that and to go find the data. And really, in the video, this gentleman, Shepard, he talks about expanding your radius. Like, don't let your brain narrow your radius. Know what your brain is doing and then work to expand your radius. So teachers are not immune from bias. We are humans. All humans are biased. So teachers are biased as well. And we're carrying all those cognitive biases with us. We've had all those different life experiences that may make us think or believe in different ways. We hold stereotypes and prejudices and potentially engage in discriminatory behavior. Chances are it is implicit. It's probably not even something that you're aware of, but it's something that we all do. And this is dangerous because teachers have a lot of power over the children in their care. So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you feel about a child, if you have a positive bias towards a child or a negative bias towards a child, what you think and believe about a child can come true. And it's called the Pygmalion effect. So how we think about children dictates how we believe or how we behave towards children, and then it dictates what children do down the road. So this video on this slide, again, highly encourage you to watch it. It shows you what the Pygmalion effect is all about, but in this video they're talking about a study where they pretended that some children were smart and some children weren't, and then they stood back and watched to see how the teacher behaved. And teachers treated children that they thought were smart differently than they treated children that they thought were not smart. And the children that they thought were smart did better as the school year went along than the children that they didn't think were smart. So we planted a belief, which created a cognitive bias. That in turn influenced how teachers were interacting with children, and that in turn dictated how children functioned later on down the road. So we have to be very careful as educators, right? I don't think any of us would go into this field wanting to treat children differently or wanting them to have different outcomes, but it 100% happens. And on the next few slides, I'm going to give you some examples. So I pulled this example from your textbook, from our chapter for today. So if you look back through your textbook, you'll find this written out more extensively than I have here. But basically, there was a study there where they went into a preschool. It was a large sample with diverse children, and they were looking to see how these children were engaging in pretend play. And what they found is that teachers thought that children of different races were playing differently from each other, but they weren't. The children were actually playing in the same way as each other, but the teachers thought that they were playing differently. And it did not matter if the teacher was the same race as the child. And unfortunately, teachers had more negative ideas about the play of Black children than they did about Hispanic, white, or multiracial children. So even though all the children were playing the same, they were all doing the same quality of dramatic play as each other, teachers thought that Black children were engaging in lower quality play, and they also thought that they were less prepared for school, that they were less accepted by their peers, and that they were more prone to teacher-child conflict. So they were putting a lot of behaviors on these Black children that actually weren't there, that these children weren't exhibiting. And if we're thinking to the Pygmalion effect, right, it's pretty likely that if teachers think this way about Black children, that eventually over time they're going to get what they think, right? Like children are going to rise to the level of expectation that the teacher has or not if the teacher does not expect them to rise to a certain level. And I'll show you another example that's similar on the next slide. So this was another study that was similar to the first one, but this was more focused on discipline-related matters rather than what children were doing in terms of their engagement in school or their engagement in play. And so what they did is they asked teachers to watch videos of children. So they had them watch videos of white boys, white girls, and Black boys. And they said, keep your eye out for behavior problems. Well, the trick was that none of the children were exhibiting behavior problems. All of the children in the videos were doing exactly the same behaviors, but people were more likely to say that they thought Black boys and white boys were engaged in behaviors than Black girls or white girls. So first of all, teachers were kind of targeting boys. They thought that boys were misbehaving more than girls were, even though there weren't any actual differences. And they were also more likely to say that they thought Black boys were misbehaving than even white boys. So there was a lot of attention to boys, and then particularly Black boys. And again, it didn't seem to matter the race of the teachers. Black teachers were just as likely to say that Black boys were misbehaving as were white teachers or teachers of other racial categories. And unfortunately, this lines up with what we actually see play out in schools. So again, that Pygmalion effect. If this is what you think about children, this is what you're going to get from them, because you're treating them in ways that are likely to create the very scenario that you think is happening. And when we look at data related to suspension and behavior issues, we can see that Black boys are way more likely to be represented in special education, way more likely to be expelled from preschool, way more likely to be suspended, but they don't make up a very high percentage of the actual children who go to preschool and go to school. So they're overrepresented in these kind of negative outcome categories. And again, it's very likely due, I mean, this is what these studies are indicating, is that it's likely due to teacher bias. So we've talked about terminology, we've talked about how bias works and how we need to be careful as educators. So now let's talk about being self-reflective. So one of the easiest ways to be less biased is to dig in and think about yourself and think about, you know, that slide where I was talking about your beliefs and all those questions were on there. Like, look at those questions, think about them, try to answer them. Think about how you behave with young children. Think about if you're treating children any differently. Think about if children in your class are having differential outcomes from each other. You know, really the place to start is ourselves. That's the other thing that I really like about that cognitive bias video a few slides back, is that there's a gentleman interviewed who was engaging in bias, and then he stopped and reflected and educated himself and changed the way he was thinking about the thing that he was being biased in. And we can do that with self-reflection. So we can think about our own personal beliefs and values, particularly about people who are different from ourselves. We can think about what we believe and think about child rearing, how we interact with the children in our care. Do we have any personal feelings about behaviors, any triggers for ways in which children behave? Because if we have triggers or we have negative feelings about things, that's going to result in that prejudice, and then that's going to result in discriminatory behavior. So we always want to kind of take stock of our own feelings, beliefs, values, and attitudes. So just some additional ideas about how we can engage in self-reflective work. So I would really encourage you to collect data, like try to write down objective data about children rather than just taking your first impressions of them, allowing those subjective thoughts that aren't based in fact and reality to sort of creep in. Get to know children in your class. The more you get to know kids, the more you can serve them well and find things that you enjoy and like about them. That kind of helps reduce that bias that we have, because you're pulling that person into your in group when you get to know them instead of leaving them in the out group. Again, we talked about exploring your own biases and beliefs. Educate yourself about those cognitive biases and some other things that I'm going to talk about on the next few slides. And then really always sitting down and evaluating and trying to do a hard look at yourself, right? Like, how am I doing? What could I do better? Are there any friends that I'm maybe not treating as well as I could, or underestimating their abilities? But that self-reflective work, there's no substitute for it. We've talked about terminology. We've talked about understanding bias. We've talked about the importance of self-reflection. So next up on our earlier list is to talk about your own need to become knowledgeable about things related to diversity. So this is a little different than just learning about terminology, but this is learning things about other people that will be valuable to you and will help you to mitigate or reduce bias and also be part of your self-reflective process. So this is the learning that you need to do about the diverse world that we live in, gathering those data and those statistics and those facts and having experiences with other people. So your book gives a couple of examples. So one, well, and just to back up for a second, the reason your book is giving these examples is because it's encouraging you to become culturally competent. So when I'm saying that you need to educate yourself and you need to go round up data and stats and facts and have experiences with other people, it's to help you in this process of cultural competence. Basically, what cultural competence means is understanding and being able to interact effectively with other people because you know things about them, not just basing your interactions on what you think or feel or have heard in the past. So the examples that your book gives about becoming culturally competent is, one, you need to understand what acculturation is. and you need to understand your role in that. So acculturation is the process of people coming to your space, and in this case, your space would be your classroom. And when they come to your classroom, you're going to be teaching them the values and practices and beliefs of that setting. And you're going to be doing that through the things that you model, and you're going to be doing that through the things that you say. And so, of course, we want to make sure that that is free of that Pygmalion effect and any bias, but we need to recognize that absolutely children are coming to us for education, and they're going to get education. They're going to get acculturated into the context of that classroom, and we just need to think thoughtfully about what that means and what we're doing. So another example that your book gives is thinking about what kind of children are coming our way. And we're going to talk about this more on the next slide as well, but diversity means that people are diverse from each other and that people don't all do things the same way, and that's not bad. It's good to have diversity. It's good for people to do things different ways. Yes, it makes a little bit more work, right? When we have to think about how are we going to mesh together all these different ways of thinking about things and doing things, but it creates a richer, more complex fabric that's good for everyone over the long haul. So some cultures are much more individualistic, like the United States, like prototypical United States, kind of Euro-Americans who are part of the fabric of the United States tend to be more individualistic, whereas Hispanic culture, Native American culture, so indigenous people tend to be more collectivist or interdependent. And so when you have children and families coming to your classroom who have these two very different ways of navigating the world, and you can see what those differences exactly are on this graphic to the left, you have to figure out how you can adapt your classroom in a way that works for everyone. Our goal isn't to change what people are like culturally. Our goal is to figure out who people are culturally and then figure out how we can make that work for everyone in classrooms. So as I was saying on the previous slide, part of learning about diversity is recognizing these diverse voices. So I do want to talk briefly about a couple things that have been debated in the field of early childhood related to this. So if you remember, we were talking about before when we talked about DAP, that DAP kind of got bashed at one point because it wasn't considered to be very culturally appropriate. That's when people were saying, oh, hey, we need to do developmentally and culturally appropriate education because we might be focusing just a little too much on only one voice and only one kind of kid coming to our classrooms. And so DAP has had many iterations, and every time it goes along, it does a better job of addressing culture and the role of culture in young children's lives. But in particular, there was a woman named Lisa Delpit, and she was kind of a very vocal critic of developmentally appropriate practice and said really it was, especially at the beginning, was kind of a reflection of white cultural values and wasn't doing a very good job at bringing in other voices. So this is actually a quote from your book. A clear example of this orientation towards white cultural values is the role of play in early childhood education. Children are encouraged to play and explore the environment and materials and to play with and talk to adults. On the other hand, in an interdependent cultural group, learning is directed by adults and depends more on observation of adults than on play, discovery, and child-chosen activity. In these cultures, objects such as toys are less important than social interaction, and play occurs mostly with siblings and other children. Consider that children from these diverse cultural orientations might gravitate towards peers in a free-flowing preschool classroom instead of making independent choices of materials as expected by the teacher. So really, the main point here is that everything that we're doing in the classroom needs to be thought about, and we need to think about how it aligns with the different kinds of children that are coming to our class setting. And are our practices, our curriculum, our interactions, are they in alignment with those, with all of the different children that are coming, or are they only in alignment with some? And again, DAP has worked really hard on its documents to be more culturally relevant, to be more flexible, and the things that they're suggesting are appropriate and best practice or evidence-based practice, in recognition that not all cultures do things the same way, and that's okay. DAP has also created an equity position statement. So the redo of DAP and this position statement both came out in 2019. So they're relatively new. The assignment coming up on the NAUAC program documents comparison, this equity position statement is one of the documents that you have the opportunity to review and kind of tell me what you think about it. But it is specifically related to how we should navigate diversity in early childhood classrooms. So some of these criticisms, the field of ECE is working really hard and has provided a lot of documents and evidence that we can use in our self-reflective and knowledge-building work as we move forward in this diversity arena. So finally, we're up to what strategies can we use to be more diversity sensitive in our classrooms with young children. So that's what we're going to talk about on the next few slides, is things that we can do tangibly in our classrooms to mitigate against bias, make sure that we are treating all children fairly and with equity and inclusion. So I would very much encourage you to take a look at this book. Hopefully you are taking the diversity class as well in this program or in another program as you move along through your education. I would imagine that this book will be part of any diversity class that you take. It's pretty popular, it's typically used, but if not, I would encourage you to go get it for yourself, because I'm just going to give you a little taste of what this book is talking about. But this is considered to be kind of the definitive book and was actually written by a woman who worked at Pacific Oaks College, which is here in Southern California. So this is a local educator who wrote this book that is now kind of the defining textbook on how to navigate diversity-related things with young children in early childhood classrooms. So in the anti-bias education book, there are 4 main goals. One is to help children to feel good about themselves. Every child should feel positive about who they are, no matter what that is. So we want first to start with helping children to feel good about themselves. Then we want to help children to feel good about other people and to recognize that people can sometimes be different from ourselves and sometimes they are the same. So they might have a different color skin or speak a different language, but we all breathe and eat and sleep and love. And so really helping children to embrace the things that make us the same and the things that make us different. So love yourself, then love your neighbor. And then the next 2 goals of anti-bias education, number 3 is helping children to think critically, to really look at the world around them and think, oh, how does this work? Children love to do this. They love to think critically about everything. They always want to know how something works and why it does this and what does that mean. And diversity is just social studies. Diversity is looking at people and why they do the things they do and how they do the things they do. And it's really thinking about those things and asking those good questions about how the social world around us works. That is really all number 3 is referring to. And then finally, goal 4 is if we do see people behaving unfairly or in a prejudicial way towards one another, let's do something about it, right? Let's not stand back and watch people be mean to each other or treat each other unfairly. Let's say something, let's do something, let's make the world a better place. So love yourself, love your neighbor, ask all those good questions about the people in our world around us, and if we see people being unfriendly to each other, take action and see if we can fix it. So we're just going to dig into each of these goals a little bit and give a few ideas about things we can do in classrooms. If you'll notice, my ideas tend to be more focused on race. That is not the only ism that we would want to focus on in an anti-bias education approach. We would focus on ability and gender and ethnicity and religion and all the things that matter to humans. But just for the sake of simplicity, I'm giving you examples that are more focused on race. So things we can do to help kids feel positive about themselves is we can let them create portraits using people-colored material so that they can create pictures of themselves that look like themselves. I don't know if you caught in my photo of myself, but I have red hair, and I used to be quite annoyed when I was a child in school and I had to only use a red crayon to color my hair, because my hair is not really the color of a fire engine red crayon. It is very different than that, and I love people-colored crayons because then I can actually color my hair the color that it really is, which is more like kind of a penny color, I guess. Reading books that talk about the different ways that we look so that children can see themselves represented in the materials that we have access to in the classroom. Bringing in pictures of children's families and talking about who their families are and what they like to do and who is in their families. And then also allowing children to have access to toys that reflect them. So in your housekeeping area, having babies that are different colors, having things to eat with and pretend foods that represent the different kinds of things that people might eat at home and how they might eat those different things. So chopsticks and forks and knives and spoons and tortillas and all the different things that might be at children's houses that are personally meaningful and relevant to them. So the second goal of anti-bias education was helping children to appreciate the differences that exist in the world around us. So you are not going to make difference by talking about difference. Children can see that their skin is different than somebody else's skin, that their eyes are different from someone else's eyes, that someone speaks a different language. So you bringing it up and talking about it isn't going to magically make it noticeable. They're already noticing. And when we don't talk about things that children notice, then they get the feeling that there's something wrong. There's a reason why we're not talking about it. Maybe we're not talking about it because it's bad, or maybe we're not talking about it because it's something to be afraid of. So if you want children to appreciate difference, you have to talk about the things that they see and talk about them in positive ways that make children know that it is okay to talk about ways in which we differ from each other, and also talk about ways that we're the same as each other. It really does not hurt my feelings if you say you have freckles and red hair. I know that I do. And I appreciate you noticing that about me. And if you want to ask me any questions about my red hair or my freckles or how it feels to get burnt when I go out in the sun, I am happy to answer any of those things. Again, we want to provide dolls, pictures, and toys that not just represent each individual child, but represent all of the children in the room so that children can see the myriad differences that exist. This can be particularly helpful and important if you do live or work in a more homogeneous place and children aren't seeing a lot of difference. They may only see difference through the materials and activities and books that you bring in. That may be your only way to help them see and know what differences are. Luckily, again, we live here in a very diverse place, so our children get to interact with all kinds of people, but you may have to create opportunities for that in other ways if you live in a place that has less obvious diversity available. We also want to focus on that critical thinking. So how can we help children to think and get all their questions answered because they have so many questions? But one, we can teach about historical figures in a developmentally appropriate way. So when my son was in preschool, he came home one day and I didn't realize that they were talking about Martin Luther King around the Martin Luther King holiday, but he came home and he said, "Yeah, that man Martin, he was a good man. I love Martin." And I was like, I have no idea who Martin is. And then finally I was like, oh, Martin Luther King. You're talking about Martin. Oh, and I said, yes, Martin was a good man. He was a kind man, and he worked hard to make everyone feel included and have, the same, get to do the same things as each other. And then he went on to talk about Rosa and how great Rosa was and how anybody can sit anywhere they want to on the bus. And I just thought it was fabulous that he was learning about these things. And he wasn't learning about them in a way that wasn't age appropriate or something that he didn't understand. What they were really talking about is, situations where sometimes people aren't treated fairly, and people who were trying to help make sure that it was fair for other people, right? That people get to vote and people get to have a drink of water out of the same water fountain and people get to sit where they want to on the bus. And that was all he really needed to know about that issue at that particular time. Another thing that we can do to help children engage in these kinds of conversations is called persona dolls. So I've put on this slide some pictures of persona dolls, and basically they are dolls that look different ways, and you can create stories to go with these dolls. You can make the stories just about their families or the kinds of things they like to eat or the music they listen to or the holidays they celebrate. You could also use them to talk about how people might treat other people, like maybe one persona doll doesn't get to play with the other persona dolls and is feeling left out, and you can talk about why sometimes people get left out and why that hurts people's feelings. But these dolls can be a great way to talk honestly with children about the injustice that sometimes does exist in the world. Because again, not only do they see differences, but they do see when people treat other people unfairly or say unkind things about other people who might be in a group different than that of themselves. And finally, if a child does behave in a way that's biased, we want to directly address it. We don't want to let those things go, like, oh, they're just little children, or oh, it's just words, or oh, it's not that big a deal, or oh, it doesn't matter, because generally it does. So for example, a lot of times children, if they see someone who can't do things like themselves, they might refer to them as a baby. So they might refer to a child in a wheelchair as a baby, or a child who speaks another language and therefore isn't talking much in the classroom as a baby, or someone who can't cut with scissors as a baby, because they don't really have other language to use. To them, anybody who can't do the things that they do is a baby because they're little. But that's not true. So they're not trying to be mean, and this is why, we typically talk about pre-prejudice in young children. We don't talk about children as actually, like young children as being actually prejudiced, because they aren't old enough to really be prejudiced yet, but they're heading that direction. And if we don't do anything to head it off at the pass, they might end up being prejudiced and treating people in discriminatory ways. So if you hear children say things that are untrue, or you see them treating people unfairly, it's really important to step in a developmentally appropriate, kind, nurturing, growth-minded kind of way. And you can, so for that example of a baby, you can say, no, they're not a baby. They're the same age that you are. You're 3 and your friend is 3, but all 3-year-olds can do different things. And some 3-year-olds can walk, and some 3-year-olds can talk, and some 3-year-olds need, move in a wheelchair, and some 3-year-olds cut with scissors, and that we're all different, right? That not all 3-year-olds do exactly the same things, but that does not make somebody a baby. If you see children saying that they don't want to play with somebody else, even if you don't know the reason why, you need to address that, right? Like, everyone at this school gets to play because we all are in this school together, right? So everyone gets the same opportunities to use the material. There's a great woman, her name is Vivian Goosen Paley, and one of the books that she wrote is You Can't Say You Can't Play. And so that's one of the things that she would teach her young children that she worked with, is you don't have to be friends with everybody, but you can't tell somebody that they can't play, because the school and the materials in it belong to everyone. So, the main thing here is just don't sweep things under the rug or ignore things, because that's how bias takes root. That's how we create ideas and values and beliefs about the people in our world. And also, if we don't see people directly addressing things, we won't learn how to directly address things either. And then when we're older, we won't know how to jump in when somebody has said or done something that's unfair. So not only are we teaching children skills of kindness and reducing bias, but we're also teaching them skills of how to exist in a world where things aren't always fair and people don't always treat each other with kindness and equity. So this last slide has some videos that I think you'll enjoy. It's some good ones so that you can learn a little bit more about anti-bias education. There's also one in there about supporting English language learners. I didn't really touch on that so much, but as I noted at the beginning, in terms of diversity, particularly in our state, we have a lot of racial diversity and we also have a lot of linguistic diversity. So it's important to think about how to navigate early education systems for children who might be learning another language or know a language and then be learning English on top of that. So most of the videos are fairly short, but I do think that you will find them helpful and they will further explain some of the points that I was talking about, particularly with strategies to use in classrooms related to diversity.